have an obsession with fire that really, oh, how come I'm not getting my thing to move? We have an obsession with fire that really I like to boil down to staring at hot soot. And though that seems kind of trite, it actually has sort of influenced how we measure and think about fire. Now that we think about it in the context of the science community, we largely focus on temperature changes, energy release rates, color changes, mass loss rates, maybe the rate of spread in the scorch height. Those are all things that are visually, for the most part, stimulating or really focus on the flame itself and the movement of that flame. We can see that at all scales of measurement. You've got everything from the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab here at the top left, and we're looking at Mark Finney and Jack Cohen thinking about convective heat transfer, to thinking about satellite observation of large wildfires and everything in between. We really have been focusing on heat fluxes and temperature changes, things along those lines, but really mostly in the electromagnetic spectrum. What we haven't been thinking about as much is the sound of fire. And it sounds maybe at first like it could be a little kooky, but really acoustics in combustion is pretty well established in a variety of fields, including mechanical engineering, where sound is a known byproduct of combustion that can lead to thermoacoustic instabilities in engines. In fact, there are entire facilities, including this one that I'm picturing here at NASA, that are built to focus just on minimizing those acoustic instabilities associated with the combustion process. You don't want your engine to fall apart from turbulent vortex shedding inside. Similarly, in forensics, we're seeing an uptick in gunshot acoustics where they're using these microphones arrays around particularly sensitive communities to try to target the location and type of gunshot that could be present. And they're really picking up in their intelligence in this context. So let's start from the beginning here. What is the sound? Because we're so focused on the light that we're receiving. What is the sound that we're receiving? So it's a pressure wave. If you focus on those little red dots that are in this little animation, you'll notice that they're wiggling back and forth. They're oscillating back and forth between a condensed part of the air, if we're going to talk about air for a moment, and sort of the less dense part of the air. And that gives you kind of an idea of the wiggle or motion that we're going to be seeing later in some of the figures. But it's really a movement of compressed fluid, or air in this case, in some transverse direction. So the sound varies all the way down from infrasound, which is for us below audible, all the way up to ultrasound. Today, we're going to be spending most of our time in the sonic region where we largely hear, but we will be going a little bit dipping into the low end of the ultrasonic frequencies. So what are we missing without sound? This video on the left had no sound. If we focus now on that sound that's coming through on the right, you should hear a little bit of crackling. The sound is giving you a sense of the overall magnitude of this fire. In this case, it's a little bit easier to tell because we've got some laboratory equipment in the background. If you have a keen eye, you can get a sense of, okay, well, now I have an idea of scale. Let's do another one. Here's a prescribed fire without sound, and with the sound added in. It might be telling you a little bit about the moisture of the fuels that are being burned, the intensity. Maybe you intuitively have a sense that, hey, this is a pretty chill fire. That rental vehicle that we just scanned past is perfectly fine. But without the sound, can you tell? So can wildland fire acoustics tell us a little bit more? We're naturally alert to the roaring and crackling sounds that are in fire. As fire observers, we intuitively respond to changes in volume when something builds up in its amplitude or its overall volume behind us or dies down. It intuitively gives us a sense of whether or not we should be turning around. Likewise, the timbre, or that sort of specific frequency signature. So you can tell the difference between when Jack was talking at the beginning of this introduction and when I'm talking, right? We each have a unique signature to our voice, in the same way that when things are burning out in the forest, they each have their unique signature. I know, for example, that Engelmann spruce is going to sound like corduroy pants when it's burning, whereas maybe sparkleberry is going to sound just the way that its name sounds. It's going to have kind of this firecracker associated with it. And then likewise, the number of unique events that might be occurring or crackling sounds that you might be experiencing, they might also alert you to something changing. Maybe something dies down and you're like, okay, I can turn my back on that. You don't necessarily always have to look at absolutely everything. You can hear that. Likewise, you might have your back turned or off to the side and you hear something crackling with a larger number of crackles occurring, and that might influence you to turn your head and say, hey, I need to pay attention to that. So there's a lot wrapped up in both roaring and crackling sounds. For today, we're just going to focus on the crackling sounds. So these crackling sounds are what are called an acoustic impulse event. You can think of these as everything from a balloon popping to your finger snapping or your hand clapping. All of these images I've depicted here are all different examples of an acoustic impulse event. This is something where you have a really sharp, short, high amplitude disturbance to that air or fluid that the sound is moving through. We did an initial study on the crackling sound of burning vegetation as a research team, and we found that that crackling sound has a unique signature or timbre, that word I was using earlier, that's specific to the species that's burning and the level of drought stress. So this is pretty intuitive, right? When you have your, we're just going to go to the everybody likes to talk about a campfire moment. When you go to your campfire and you put a wet branch on versus a dry branch on, you intuitively know that there's going to be a difference. That wet branch is going to have kind of more of a thuddy sound to it in terms of the snapping and crackling you're going to get off of it versus a very dry branch. Likewise, if you pull, say, red pine and you pull ponderosa, and presuming that they're both in the same space, and you set those on your campfire, you intuitively know that they're going to have a different sound. So we published this work in 2017. This was all lab-based. So the picture below you're looking at is the experiment that we ran off of. So we had Western white pine needles spread out on this brick fuel bed. That yellow line on the left was the ignition line, and we had the microphone, the measurement microphone, right at that edge. And we ignited the fire as perfect of a line as we possibly could, moved through this perfectly homogeneous, well-dispersed white pine dried fuel bed, oven dried, and into those unsuspecting saplings that were given various treatments of drought stress. And then we sampled off of that. Well, that's great, but that's in the lab. So the question then follows, okay, what about changing the maturity of the plants? And what about trying to go outside? How does that influence the results? So we did exactly that. We decided to vary the species even further for mature plants instead of for young saplings. And we also chose to repeat for 2 species. So we had data for the for Engelmann spruce and Douglas fir in the lab as saplings, and we wanted to make sure to sample Engelmann spruce and Douglas fir as mature trees out in the forest. So now I'm going to go through some of the methods for how we did that. I'm happy to go through more of the details of the laboratory experiment. I know that Jack included the link to that paper also with the webinar. So feel free to poke into that or ask questions about the lab experiment afterwards. So for the field experiment, we decided to go with 6 different specific conifer species: ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine, western white pine, grand fir, Douglas fir, and Engelmann spruce. We sampled 3 trees for each species. We did this to make sure that we didn't have a signature specific to maybe some sort of issue like disease or positioning associated with a particular tree. And then within each tree, we sampled 2 separate branches, also for the same reason. We set those branches at different heights and we measured the height of each of them to see if the influence of the location of the branch itself or the specific branch chosen influenced our results. We took pre-dawn leaf water potential measures for each individual branch. The branches were harvested the morning of the study, and the timing of the branch burning was randomized to reduce that unaccounted for environmental effect. And that was everything from maybe the wind blowing differently at that particular time of day, because remember, we're taking acoustic measurements, to maybe the sun coming and going differently behind the clouds and influencing our fuel moistures as we were moving through our project. The fuel moistures were sampled just prior to each burn. And then we also measured, as I mentioned before, the height of the branch above the soil. So we dug a pit. It was a big rectangle. We put expanded steel down in the bottom that was suspended just a little bit above the surface. This was to make sure that our charcoal briquettes, which were our ignition source, were maintained. We basically made a charcoal pit in the ground. And this was because charcoal really doesn't make much sound. So we were guaranteed to have almost the entirety of our rupturing sounds, the crackling sounds, associated with the particular plants that leaves that we were going to put on that fire at any particular moment. The other nice thing about charcoal, it's pretty easy to maintain a constant intensity across that fuel bed. Same way that it's really nice for grilling. And so that helped minimize the number of factors that we had to deal with in processing the data afterwards. We used an IR camera to monitor the heat release from the charcoal. We set up a measurement microphone. The microphone is sampling at 50 kilohertz or 50,000 times a second. And we put it pretty close as we could get it to the edge. We needed to put a piece of sound dampening foam over the edge of the microphone because it's very sensitive. Mainly that is because of the wind that's passing through. So without that foam on the edge, the wind would completely swamp out any sound that we would get from the crackling. And a large part that is due to the sensitivity of the microphone itself. So this is the time series results of what sampling all of those burning needles on the charcoal looks like. So in the top left, you could see Engelmann spruce. In the top right, you would see grand fir, and so on and so on. What matters here is what we're going to be focusing on is those crazy spikes that you're going to see. So the x-axis is the microphone voltage itself, and the y-axis, or sorry, the y-axis is mic voltage, and the x-axis is time. So you can see as you progress with time, we're getting a bunch of spikes moving through. We're going to focus specifically on those spikes. Each one of those is a crack as part of the crackling. If we zoom in on them, they look like the 2 plots on the left. This is 2.5 milliseconds of time for each one of those time series you were seeing a moment earlier. So that rupturing sound that you're sampling with your ear is happening over the course of about 2.5 milliseconds. And so we have to, that's why the high measurement rate with the microphone is we need to make sure to get as many data points as we can in 2.5 milliseconds. So we went through all that data and I pulled out all of the crackling noises that were unadulterated by anything else. I wanted to make sure that there was no overlap between cracks. Anything that looked like there was 2 of them in a row, that got tossed out. And after all of that, we ended up with the total number of snaps or crackles you see here in the table on the right. So for example, 208 individual crackles were taken from Douglas fir. We have to go through a fair bit of processing of that information next. So you can imagine that as we're out there, each crack might have a different volume associated with it, or the entire experiment might have a different volume associated with it. Even though we're trying to fine tune the charcoal's intensity, we can't do that perfectly. We don't have that much control over it. So that means that each experiment is going to have a different volume associated with it. To remove the influence of that volume, we calculate the power behind each crack as a function of the power that's present in the overall experiment. So by doing that, we're erasing the influence of the volume of the individual burning event. So then what I'm going to do next is show you sort of the mean spectra. This is the last time we're going to be looking at this data in the context of time. We're going to shift over to be looking at this now in the context of frequency. So let's just orient ourselves again here. 0 kilohertz. So the x-axis is kilohertz now. So thousands of hertz. 0 on the far left, and on the far right is 25 kilohertz. So remember that I said that ultrasound starts at about 20 kilohertz or 20,000 hertz. So we're going just above this. On the y-axis is normalized power that I was just talking about. And each individual plot here, what you're looking at is all of those cracks that, say for the top one, this is grand fir, all 194 of those individual pops or cracks are lined up, so they're all in line with each other. And we took the frequency spectra, if you will, of each of those, and this is what the average spectra looks like. So basically for grand fir, we're seeing a peak showing up at about 3,000 hertz or 3 kilohertz, and another little bump showing up at about 7.5 kilohertz. And so as you go down, you can see that they all kind of have a similar shape to them. The blue fuzzy area around that is the 98% confidence interval about that dark blue line, which is the average. So I did that for all of the species that we looked at. And here in this particular plot, you're seeing the Engelmann spruce. The light blue on the top is the samples that were taken out in the field, and the grayish blue just below it are the the samples that were taken from the lab. And I apologize for the confusion on the label. Old here means older in time, not older in age. So these were the second plot down is the younger saplings that were sampled in the lab. The top one is the older mature plants that were sampled in the field. So there's a pairing also with the bottom two. We've got Douglas fir, the one that says 208 samples, that was the field experiment. And then the lowest one that says 52 samples, n equals 52, that was the laboratory experiment. So let's compare these now a little bit more systematically. Okay, so the very top is grand fir compared to lodgepole pine. And what I'm doing here is I'm subtracting the signature of grand fir from the signature of lodgepole pine. And anywhere where there's a significant difference, I have shaded that in a light blue color. So the pink, the solid pink line and the pink shaded area around it are showing you the difference of the mean and the 98% confidence interval about that difference, for those of you who are interested in the statistics piece. But what we're really after is, where are they different, these blue areas? So this is kind of hard to see, but we're just going to kind of look at this a little bit so you can get an idea of how much of a difference there is in some areas and a little bit less in others. The first one I said was grand fir versus lodgepole pine. The second one down is grand fir versus Engelmann spruce. The third one is grand fir compared to ponderosa pine. And the last one is comparing grand fir to Douglas fir. Let's look at this a slightly different way. Here we still have frequency in kilohertz on the x-axis, but instead of having those wiggly lines on the y-axis, now what I'm doing is just showing you those regions by species where there was a significant difference. So the blue demarcations or bars that are going across your screen are showing you the regions where there was a significant difference between grand fir and each of these individual species that's listed: Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, Engelmann spruce, and lodgepole pine. So you're starting to get an idea that there is a unique difference associated with each one of these, right? When we're looking at it in this regard, you can say, okay, there's possibly a pretty strong thumbprint there. Now let's do the same thing by age. So here we're looking at the difference on the top between young and old Engelmann spruce, and on the bottom between young and old Douglas fir. So we're just going to single out Douglas fir here. And the fourth down from the top, second one up from the bottom, is age. So we're seeing a unique signature associated with the age also of this for Douglas fir in particular. So one could imagine sort of building this out over a variety of scenarios, and you could almost think about accessing a acoustics library, right? Where you're sampling something and you're able to say, oh, wow, okay, I know that the fire is now moving through young or old or drought stressed, or maybe there's another factor that we haven't thought of that could be influencing the unique signature of all of this. So we've been able to show that there's uniqueness between plant species and also with age. But we need to really determine the potential unique structure in a slightly different way. One of the challenges with this kind of data is it's non-parametric. And so one of my next steps is to work with this data in a slightly different approach than I have taken before in the statistics, to explore really just how significantly different they are. The other piece that I kind of breezed past earlier that we need to mess with is thinking about the heat flux and the influence that the heat flux might be having on the overall signature of each rupture. So in exploring this, one of the really big questions that we had behind the whole experiment was, okay, well, we got lucky. We came up with a great hypothesis. Maybe it wasn't entirely lucky, it was an educated guess. But what's going on? So what is the mechanism? Please watch where that arrow is pointing as we're chatting here. What's the mechanism that is producing these impulse events, I really want to dig into that more. So my friend Ian Grubb passed me this video after I was chatting with him about my work and said, hey, have you seen this yet? Have I shared this with you? And I looked at this video he took and I was completely blown away and got super excited. So then I wrangled some poor, unfortunate undergrad students from College of Natural Resources at University of Idaho to help me out in trying to reproduce these ruptures one at a time and really be able to dig into what is it that we're hearing in the first place. So on the right here, we've got Phineas Lapman, who is a wildland firefighter in northern Idaho now. He's got his bachelor's degree from College of Natural Resources at UI. Really great research tech. I'm going to ask him to come up with a means to rupture these needles over and over again. We tried everything. And at the end of the day, a Bic lighter or some other barbecue lighter ended up being the best possible option. Now that seems silly, but at face value, but when you really dig into it, it's kind of interesting. It tells me that when we used frying pans, when we used heat guns, when we used all different types of means, the best way to get at the end was gentle convective heating. We could do it with a Bunsen burner, but the Bunsen burner was so loud we couldn't hear the crackling sounds. So we've got gentle convective heating that's really doing a lot of this rupturing. So I'm going to ask Finn to do that over and over again until he hears a pop. And then once he hears that pop, we're going to go looking for it and try to figure out what happened in that rupture site. And I'm actually going to enlist some additional help. So on the bottom right here, we've got research botanist James Reiser, who's now working with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And he's going to volunteer a little bit of time as well. And the two of these guys took time to slice along the needle. So here's my physics drawing of a conifer needle. On the far right, that little brown chunk is the fascicle end. We've got water moving in and out of this, and they're gonna slice across this in the radial direction, and see when they can start to find the damaged tissue. So here's an example of one of those cross sections. I've got each part of the needle labeled so we can kind of orient ourselves. So we'll start in the middle. We've got a vascular bundle there that's surrounded by an endodermis. Outside of the endodermis is the spongy green mesophyll. Around the edges, before you get to the cuticle and epidermis, you see resin ducts. One of the things that I was incredibly surprised by was my hypothesis revolved around the fact that I thought that the resin ducts were the things that were rupturing. And over again, when we did this work where we were looking at the rupture sites afterwards, we became increasingly convinced that the resin ducts had nothing to do with the rupturing of the needle. Here are some examples that Phineas took in our very initial work. On the left is grand fir before and after rupture. You can see that a large chunk of that mesophyll has completely been blown away. And interestingly, as an aside, grand fir seems to be one of the most explosive needles to be rupturing. On the right is Douglas fir, so it's a little bit more conservative in terms of the amount of tissue lost. But note that the rupture is not anywhere near where the resin duct is. Okay, on the left, here's some figures that Dr. Reiser made. On the left, we have red pine. And again, in a lot of these cases, the resin ducts are either still intact, or if they are damaged, it looks like the origin of the damage was not the duct, but that the duct was part of the explosive release in that process. On the right is longleaf pine. Similar situation going on. So we're seeing that the rupture is originating from the mesophyll, not from the resin duct, which we think is pretty fascinating. So we have to kind of revisit an idea here, right? When we do modeling of fuels and fire, we think of a fuel as just a pot on a stove. It's got some pressure that's about equal to the ambient pressure of the environment. And that water just politely leaves in the process of drying out the vegetation, and then we can catch that vegetation on fire. And we've heard this over and over again. It's our mantra, we all believe it, and I believed it. But when I thought about it further, I was like, no, maybe this doesn't make sense at all, because the pressure inside of the live vegetation is not at all equal to the pressure of the atmosphere. It's actually higher. And then when we add heating to that, what is that doing? So I would argue that these are absolutely not appropriate assumptions to be making. And I'll see if I can't convince you in the next set of slides. I'm going to be showing you a set of videos where we used a particular visualization technique called Schlieren imaging. Schlieren imaging is when you take a light source, so that's the source on the bottom right, you're going to pass it through a pinhole, and then you're going to shoot it at a collimating mirror. A collimating mirror makes sure that the light all goes in exactly parallel lines. In the middle of all of that, we're going to stick a fire. Then that light's going to pass to another collimating mirror, which is going to narrow that light back down again and point it towards the edge of a light knife, and then onto an imaging optics. What happens is, when you have fluids of different densities interacting with that collimated light, the light starts to bend in different directions. And so then when that bent light makes it to the knife edge, it'll either hit the knife edge or move past it or go the opposite direction entirely. And so you end up with this image of light and dark that's influenced by the density of the particular fluid that you're looking at. In our case, we were starting by looking at air, and then what happens as a result of the rupturing of the needle. So in the next slide, before I push next, what you're going to see is a Douglas fir needle that's being held by a tiny alligator clip, just one individual needle. Below it, you're going to see a barbecue lighter. This is all done in that study area that you're looking at right now in the collimated light. So you can see the hot gases from the Bic lighter moving past the needle, and now something's starting to come slowly out of the needle. A little bit more intensely. And now the needle has blown out the lighter. One of the really cool things about this particular type of imaging is that there's no distortion in the picture. So from top to bottom of this image is slightly less than 6 centimeters across. A Douglas fir needle is 1 inch long. So the jet from this Douglas fir needle is shooting more than 3 inches out from the source, and it just blew out the lighter. You might say that was a lucky catch. Well, it happened again. Here's an earlier video that we took. This has a slightly more extreme frame rate, so it'll take just a little bit longer to play through. There again is a jet coming off of a Douglas fir needle. There's a couple things that are really interesting about these jets. You can get more than 1 per needle. So if that lighter had not been blown out, it would have been highly likely that we would have seen at least 1 more, if not 2 more, coming off of this 1 inch long needle. If you reduce the size of the heat source, so if I make the flame more precise and less fat, I can actually get more jets and ruptures off of an individual needle. If I make the source fatter, I usually get just 1 or 2. You can get upwards of 40 of these, depending on the size of the needle and how precise you can apply the heat to the needle, which is fascinating. The other thing of interest is that we started this whole project off thinking about crackling sounds. Not all of these ruptures produced crackling sounds, but all of the crackling sounds were associated with these ruptures, which is interesting. So big picture, this is pretty exciting, right? Because it not only says we've got ruptures going on, we've got this mechanism where some sort of fluid, which looks to not be flammable because it blew out the lighter, it didn't create a flamethrower, is blowing past. And instead of having this surface, like the one you see on the left, the lighter blue box, where we're just passively heating something until the water just politely somehow magically leaves and then we're going to catch it on fire, we've got the box on the right, where we've got an exchange of energy happening, and we actually have a leaf or needle that's producing a jet that's influencing the flow around it, right? Think about how that jet might be influencing not just the flow around itself, but its neighbors in the context of a branch and a bunch of leaves in a whirl. Now all of a sudden we have a totally different heat transfer experience than we did before. So from this, we've determined that water is likely the dominant material jetting from the conical needle that's being tested, and that jet is influencing that boundary layer for the rupturing needle. Those microscopy images also support this by suggesting that the origin of the jet is the mesophyll of the needle, not the resin ducts, which I originally thought was the case. So our current ongoing work at this point is to collect and analyze that rupture material content, and we're in process of this now. I'm happy to share some of the preliminary details. I don't have data yet at this point, but of how we're going to go about that. And then evaluate the spatial extent of that rupture phenomenon, right? Like how far does that jet actually go? And then also quantify the flow characteristics of the jet. That was a pretty eruptive behavior taking place. How much power is behind it? What's going on within the needle to be producing that much force as it's exiting the needle? Here's myself and several colleagues staring at longleaf pine burning. Our intention is to really be thinking about this for now in the context of prescribed burning, where we think that the gentler convective heating might be more common and also result in sort of an application that makes sense for thinking about this. Do I think that this scenario is going to play out the same way in a large wildfire event that it does in a prescribed burn? Absolutely not. I think that there are different scenarios where maybe this scale of influence doesn't matter, and then there's going to be scales where it absolutely matters. And so digging that out of all of this, I think, is an important piece. And with that, I'm going to stop so that we can have a good conversation. I'd like to thank my research team, which I've listed up above, as well as a whole variety of institutions and folks who have volunteered their time. Thank you, everybody.
Excellent, Kara. We do have some questions here, and remind folks, type your questions in now and we'll get to them. So Kara, are you able to open the question and answer box? And
let me see if I can.
Okay, so I can start with the one before, or with one, and if you can't get it open. So Marty Alexander asked, what dates were the field study, or was the field study done?
What days?
What dates?
Dates. Oh geez, for the North Idaho stuff?
Yes, yes.
That was done in the spring of 2018.
And I guess Marty, I would clarify, are you looking for like season or year? I guess so. While we're waiting on that, let's see, Marty mentioned that Fletcher in Utah has reported on leaf rupture from heating. So I don't know if that was considered.
Yep. So I've talked with Tom Fletcher a fair bit about his work. They have a whole different scenario set up. They're largely trying to completely oven dry fuels beforehand, and they're really after consumption of that particular leaf and not the intermediate activities taking place. Marty, interestingly though, I have oven dried individual needles and looked at these up close, and they also produce a rupture. So that rupture, I have not, it's not putting out flames, but it is producing some sort of gas or other fluid, who knows what, that is erupting from the needle. And that's a whole nother line of inquiry that we need to go down.
All right. Julie asked, have you observed the jets coming from the needles in other species besides Douglas?
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. So all of the 6 species that I was presenting on for the leading up study on acoustics, they all produce the jets. I have witnessed it in shortleaf pine, longleaf pine, loblolly pine, red pine, Scotch pine. Geez, what else have we messed with? Cedars are really good at this. So there's quite a few that, oh, sparkleberry, messed with sparkleberry a little bit. Basically, I haven't found a leaf yet that I can't rupture, but I would be willing to try anything someone wants to send my way if they're curious.
Okay. We'll make sure your contact information is there available on the website too.
Yeah.
Anne asks, any intent to conduct experiments on a slope and thoughts on possible influence of that?
Oh, the influence of slope. Okay. So I feel like in the context of this, slope is likely going to produce more convective heating. And this gets back at that comment I made earlier about fire intensity. I think that there is something to intensity specific, the heat flux that's specifically coming from convective heating, the amount, the fluctuation of it, all of those pieces. So I think if I really teased it apart, I don't know if I would do an experiment out in the field at this point, specifically focused on slope. But I think what I would do is pull it apart in pieces and look at varying that convective heat, both in terms of fluctuations and in terms of overall intensity, for the sake of digging into this more. And then I think the next step past that would be to go out on a sloped site versus a flat site and see if we get the same results. Good question.
Okay. Let's see. Marty clarified he was looking for more of the month or even the day for the field studies.
Oh, okay. Marty, I'm going to have to look that up because I don't remember the exact. Let me see. I don't think I have my field notebook in front of me right now. I can get back to you on that, and I have your email, so I'm going to make a note right here to do that. I'm pretty sure it was June of 2018, but the particular days I don't remember. What I can tell you, though, it was very moist. So moist, actually, that the mosquitoes were horrible, and we donated a ton of blood to North Idaho that week. But otherwise, I don't remember the details. I can tell you from the leaf water potential measures that the moisture content, the drought stress level was like next to none for all of these mature plants. They were very well watered, if that helps. But I'll pass you the dates, Marty.
Okay. See, Troy asked, he's curious as to your thoughts on getting the recordings in an actual wildland fire, and it would be too hot to get close enough to get good signal to noise from the microphone.
It depends on the fire. So I have been having a lot of conversations with Joe O'Brien down in Athens, Georgia, and he was taking some measurements of of sound, not the same quite measurements, off to the side of prescribed fires, and was having pretty good luck at that. And I've actually taken measurements alongside prescribed fires with a totally different piece of sound equipment. I was looking at infrasound, so below audible sound waves, which I can also talk about if people are curious. But I think getting inside the fire is going to be a little bit tricky. Interestingly, I was just chatting with a research tech at NIST, and they're interested in actually giving people a virtual reality experience of being inside of a burning building. So they're in the process of working on a microphone array that can withstand fire inside of a structure. So I'm hoping to tag along with them and be able to come up with a similar design that could work. I'm hoping within the next 5 to 7 years, depending on funding and what tech is necessary, to be able to put this out in a wildfire. In the meantime, I'm going to have to just be very careful in setting up microphone arrays around fire events as best as I can.
And just as an aside, there are some really nice 360-degree videos that were taken in New Jersey Pine Bush territory of wildland fires. So they're able to do that from the video context. And I'm not sure if you're aware of that or others are aware of that, but putting a plug in for that. Let's see, we have a question. Could the sound be coming from the branches or bark?
Yes, it's also going to be coming from the branches and bark. The particular study that we did, we plucked the needles off of the branches so that we did not have that influence, so that we could get just the pure sound from the needles themselves. They were plucked immediately before they were burned. But absolutely. In fact, I have a lot of people asking me, what is the popping sound that's coming from wood? And given that I've just donned the hat of working at the Forest Products Lab and thinking about the built environment, one of the rabbit holes that I intend on going down here pretty soon is what is the rupturing or cracking sound. I don't know if it's necessarily a rupture in that case, that's associated with wood. And I have a feeling that that's going to translate to the branches piece. The bark, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer, but it'd be fun to dig in.
Another research project.
Yeah, totally.
Let's see, Matt's asked, have you considered seasonality as it pertains to foliar moisture and density?
So the first study that we did, that I just breezed over really quickly, we drought stressed half of the saplings, and then we left the other half of the saplings well watered for the sake of being able to, it doesn't get at seasonality per se, but it does get at foliar moisture content. And there very definitely was a signature associated with the drought stress level of the plant. I absolutely think that there's going to be an influence of seasonality as well. If for no other reason, then you're going to have young needles that are coming out, inflating, and then building structure, along with those older needles that will have live foliar moisture that's going to be varying during that whole process. Because the rupturing appears to be tied to the unique structure associated with the needle, I think there's going to be quite a bit of nuance around what they sound like, specific to timing of year, drought stress level, all of those pieces.
So that's potentially another rabbit hole to go down, correct? So
yeah.
to collect needles at different times of the year. And Matt followed up, he'll send information on jack pine, because I'm sure that's what he's referring to, jack pine and red pine in the lake states during the spring dip versus other times of the year.
Oh yeah, cool. That would be fun.
Let's see, Miles has asked, when you were analyzing the acoustics of burning different species, did you look at any background measurements for burning the charcoal briquettes, only to see what their contribution to frequency and amplitude was or would be?
I looked at them long enough to scrub that information out. So The charcoal briquettes, that burning was recorded for 10 seconds prior to the needles going onto the briquettes, every single burn. So if we did whatever 6 times, 3 times, I can't do that in my head, but we did a lot of burns. Before every single burn, we recorded acoustically and with the IR camera what was going on with the charcoal briquettes. And then when I process the data, what I do is I call the charcoal briquette burning part of my ambient sounds, and I remove that from the rest of the signature. In that particular case, I feel pretty confident that I've been able to remove it well. If you were interested in knowing more about the sound of the charcoal briquette itself, I can poke at that. I think that might be less, I don't know, I think maybe in the context of smoldering combustion, it could be interesting. But anyway, I have a field experiment, which the data I haven't really tackled yet, that involved a location where there were quite a few woodpeckers that decided to just be super active the same time that we were trying to record these ruptures. And so I have my work cut out for me in removing those background sounds, especially the impulse event of a woodpecker tapping the same time I'm trying to get these crackling bits. That'll be a little trickier, but probably not impossible.
That's pretty good. Let's see. Miriam asks, yes, so is the webinar being recorded? Will be available to share? Yes. This webinar is being recorded right now. And Kara also provided the PDF of this talk, and that'll be posted up on the webinar page, which is always archived. And you can always contact me direct too if you want to find that link. So let's see, Marty asked, what do you see are some of the practical applications of this kind of work?
Oh, good question, Marty. I get this a fair bit. Let's start with right now, I'm exploring the technique to see if it's even viable. I think that we need to be measuring fires in different ways than the way we have been if we want to enrich the data in any fashion. So we can keep measuring temperatures over and over again and get the same answer and model those in different ways. But at the end of the day, are we learning anything new? So this is all being explored in the context of, if we try to use a couple different measurement techniques, what's the information, and can we use it with the already established techniques to enrich our understanding of fire? So in the grand scheme of things, on the science end, I'm hoping that this will give us a better understanding of, in like a highly instrumented science burn, this is what the fire's doing, this is where it's going, that sort of thing. Bigger picture, I think that going down this rabbit hole of rupturing and what's happening with the needles might have a pretty big impact in us thinking about how fuels are clustered together and what kinds of fuels are clustered together in prescribed fire. In wildland fire scenarios, I think it also has application in thinking about crown fire and when crown fire can persist and when it becomes marginal burning and drops back down again. So I think there's applications. I think that they're pretty far out still, but there are so many questions left to answer before this is going to be something that, like, I can hand you a microphone you can strap on your shoulder and wear out in the field and then bring it back to me and I can tell you everything you experienced. I don't think that's where I'm headed with this. I think where I'm headed with this is really thinking a little bit more deeply about what's going on with live fuels and fire and live fuels, and also providing some measurements that we're missing in fire science to really be able to dig deeper.
And our next question that we have, and it may apply to the previous one, what practical applications. So in regards to sound perception, how may a firefighter's experience of sound relate to understanding safety in the field during wildland fires?
Oh, good question. So I can only answer this by anecdote because that's all I have. So I'm going to preface this with, I'm a scientist, and I do not have a background in wildland fire. So I want you to know that in advance. In talking with wildland firefighters, though, about this work as I travel around the country, I've been in the back of an Uber car, and the person driving turned out to be a wildland firefighter. There's been a lot of really random places where I've had this conversation. One of the things that keeps popping up is that it tells them more intuitively about when to be alert and when not to. So the first time I gave this talk, talking about just the crackling sounds before I even knew anything about the rupturing jets, I had someone approach me afterwards and say, you know, I make decisions on whether or not I'm going to burn my land that I'm managing by how these particular species sound when I hold them in my hand and burn them with a lighter. I was just like, whoa, this is awesome. That is so cool. Tell me more. And then a couple of months later, I had someone else tell me that they pay attention to the sound, and they just hadn't realized that they were paying attention to it. They just intuitively do it. They turn their head when they hear more sparkly sounds, or maybe they don't pay attention to the crackling sounds when they sound a little bit more thumpy. And then just this last fall, I was in that Uber car I was talking about, and the gentleman who was driving me was talking about, as a dozer driver, he notices when the number of cracking sounds starts to pick up, and he starts to pay attention, and he knows when he needs to be really alert, because if they really start firing off quite a lot, he knows that something has changed in his particular environment. What's tricky with all of those anecdotes is it's very specific to the region and the fuels that you're working with. So I think that all kind of has to be interpreted in that context.
I will concur with all your assessments. I think any of the attendees on the call who have wildland fire experience, you know, they're very familiar with certain sounds and react differently to different sounds. Whether it's snap, crackle, pop, you name it.
Right, right. Awesome.
We'll give another few seconds here. If there's any other questions, please type them in. I am looking, I kind of had some questions written, but we've gone through most of them. A little side question is, with all the different types of acoustic impulse events that you have recorded, I mean, you could put those all together in some type of fire symphony.
Oh yeah, yeah. Actually, so Jack, I had an acoustic artist, maybe would be the right way to put it. He's a professor out of Oregon. Contacted me recently and asked if he could borrow some of my recordings and wanted to interview me about fire, because he was interested in building an installation in New York City, which he did. This was this last fall. It's been up and down, where they moved the sound of fire past the listening observer through a series of speakers to be able to give the observer a sense of the experience of wildland fire for folks who have never experienced it before. And he specifically targeted New York because he had a bunch of friends there who were asking him questions about fire and obviously really needed to have an experience associated with it.
That is neat.
Yeah, totally. In fact, if I remember, here, I'll make myself a note. I'll pass you the information about his installation because you'd probably dig it.
Good. Well, let's see. I've not seen any more questions, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So again, this is being recorded, and we'll make sure that this recording and a PDF of the talk is on the archive webpage. Kara's information, contact information is on there, so if you want to contact her direct with questions, I'm sure she would accept those gladly. And with that, unless you have any other words, Kara, we'll wrap this up.
No, that's great. Thank you. And if I mentioned anything else that folks had questions about that we didn't talk about today, please contact me. More than welcome. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for attending, and watch for our next webinar, which is in May.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.